Today marks the 25th anniversary of UFC 1, November 12th, 1993, Denver, Colorado. This is a big monument for the UFC, 25 years. So I want to give a little bit of background history of what led up to and included the first few UFCs for all the casual fan listeners of the show that may not know the exact history. So UFC was initially proposed to John Milas and Rorion Gracie by Art Davie, one of the original founders, as an 8-man elimination tournament. He initially wanted to call it War of the Worlds. The tournament itself was inspired by the Gracies in Action video series that they had put out down in Brazil, which featured several of the Gracie family members using jiu-jitsu as a way to defeat martial artists, from karate, kung fu, taekwondo, kickboxing, that kind of thing. So the plan for the initial UFC tournament was that it would also feature martial artists from other disciplines facing each other, as we saw in a very no-holds-barred combat situation, really as a method to see which martial arts form was the greatest, which was the best. And they really thought, Art Davies thought, that this would be a way to bring true excitement back into combat sports. So John Milius was a noted film director, songwriter, screenwriter, involved in all sorts of the entertainment industry, was a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu student. So that's how he fell into the mix. So they drafted a business plan, and Art Davies and Milius, they were able to get 28 separate investors to contribute to the initial startup of UFC. It was originally under the WOW Promotions banner, and their original intent was to create a tournament format that would create a television franchise, much like a WWE type ongoing thing. So they initially they sought out a television partner. They were looking at pay-per-view, they were looking at HBO, Showtime, as well as Campbell McLaren and some other entertainment groups. But HBO and Showtime declined. But they found SEG, who was at the time a pioneer in pay-per-view television, and they had done a lot of offshoot events such as Jimmy Connors versus Martina Navratilova and that kind of stuff. So they partnered up with Art Davies and WOW to create this new fighting format television program. They had someone come in, build the octagon. They trademarked the octagon as the signature piece. It was the show piece of the event. We had the fighters, we had the name, but the octagon was the centerpiece. That was the symbol of this free format fighting system. So eventually they got away from the War of the Worlds name, and they came up with the Ultimate Fighting Championship. As we know it now, it just pretty much goes by UFC. So they called the first event UFC 1, and again they held it in November 12th, 1993 at McNichols Arena in Denver. Art Davie was the show's booker. He handled all the matchmaking, all that kind of stuff. And if you've seen any of the posters, any of the old advertising for it, it was all based on, we want to answer these questions. Can a wrestler beat a boxer? Can a kickboxer beat a ground fighter? Who is the greatest martial artist in the world? So, and as with most martial arts at the time, fighters typically only trained in one discipline. MMA wasn't really a thing, so there was no cross-training through various disciplines. You did one thing. You were a Wing Chun guy or a Taekwondo guy or a Jiu-Jitsu guy, but you were not a rounded martial artist. So that really set the stage for the comparison of who is the best warrior. So the initial pay-per-view card, the initial fight, featured kickboxer Patrick Smith and Kevin Rozier, savate fighter Gerard Gordeau, karate expert Zane Frazier, shoot fighter Ken, the most dangerous man in the world, Shamrock, sumo wrestler and now star on Hawaii Five-0, Taylor Tooley, and boxer Art Jimerson, as well as the famed welterweight, 175-pound jiu-jitsu black belt, Royce Gracie. And as most of us know, Royce is the younger brother of one of the founders, Rorion Gracie. Rorion handpicked, and many of you have heard this story, but Rorion handpicked Royce to be the family's entrant into the tournament because of his small size and stature compared to several of the other Gracie brothers. He wanted to prove without a doubt that jiu-jitsu was the greatest martial arts, the greatest combat skill, and by having the smallest Gracie brother in there competing, by him winning, which Rorion believed he would win, would prove that a guy of much smaller stature with jiu-jitsu skills could out-combat any other competitor from any of the other disciplines. So that was the reason that Royce, the smallest of the Gracie brothers, was the entrant from the Gracie family into UFC 1. And he was correct. I'm sure many of you have watched the original UFC. There were some very interesting matches in the tournament. Taylor Tooley lost within the first, 10, 12 seconds. He got kicked in the face, and you can see his tooth fly out. Art Jimerson boxing with just a glove on his left hand, and some very interesting matchups because it was something we had never seen before. But Rorion proved right, and Royce was able to win the tournament, successfully submitting Art Jimerson, Shamrock, and Gerard Gordeau in succession. So by 3 submission victories, Royce won the original UFC 1 tournament. And at that time, as a pay-per-view, the show was extremely successful. It did 86,500 pay-per-view buys, which by today's standards is horrendous. But at that time, that was a huge number for pay-per-view because people didn't have pay-per-view. Not everybody had cable. It was just, obviously, 25 years ago, entertainment was a whole different world. So 86,000 pay-per-view buys for an initial event that had never been tested before, never been shown, was a huge success. So there's much dispute on whether they really intended it to be a series of future events or a smaller weekly, monthly television show, but much of the talk was that it was only to be a one-off, despite what Davey came after the fact and said his whole plan was to make it a television program. But they did so well on the first one, they decided to do a second one, and then another, and another, and another, and it snowballed for a while. But it was never mentioned, and to this day never thought to believe that Art Davey and Rorion and that they were creating a sport. Never was their intent to create a brand new, organized, top-tier pop culture sport that is MMA. That was not, I don't think they had that kind of foresight. I don't think they had that kind of vision to see that they were doing. And basically at the time it was nothing they'd ever done before. All the disputes with governments and John McCain in Arizona, all that stuff that came along with it being labeled as human cockfighting. And, there was much discussion of whether something like this, without sanction, without gloves, or that was even legal. So what they were doing, legal, yada, yada. But that's where we get UFC as we know it today. No weight classes, no divisions, no set gear, very few rules. I believe no biting, no eye gouging. And that was about it. No holds barred, really no holds barred. And again, the the entertainment value that came with it was not only the style differences and the discipline differences, but the sheer size differences, the Andre the Giant type atmosphere. When you've got people like a very large Emmanuel Yarborough in UFC 3. It's 600 pounds fighting Keith Hackney, who was 400 pounds lighter. Things like that. The Hoist Gracie against the much bigger guys. So that was the entertainment value. Not so much even just the fighting styles, but the size differences, the disparity between individuals, pitting the David versus Goliath in the cage. Seeing that kind of almost can be seen, as much as we like it now as a legitimate sport, almost can be seen as a freak show back then. These giant men taking on these tiny, smaller guys, a smaller Brazilian in a gi versus a giant guy, kickboxer in a singlet, whatever it might be. So that's where we came from the UFC. That was the initial show 25 years ago. In UFC, they had UFC 2, then UFC 3. We had the event in Dothan, Alabama, and then we started to get into tournament style, to where there was a belt, the champion. Again, rounds in single day tournaments. Hoist Gracie, Ken Shamrock super fights, and then we had Dan Severn, and we had Don Fry. We really started to cultivate some superstars in this very early young sport. In UFC 6 was the first event to crown a non-tournament champion, Ken Shamrock. So it quickly evolved from what it was into this one-off kind of, freak show oddity event into a legitimate sport with more strict ground rules, more strict tournament format, and really creating something that we're now enjoying 25 years later as a mainstream, top-tier, $4 billion sport. Obviously, we all know that the UFC, it grew a little bit, and then it kind of fell to the wayside and was on the brink of going under. Along comes Dana White and the Fertitta brothers, and they approached the UFC and SEG and offered to buy them in the year 2000. And from there, that's where the tide really turns, and the UFC started to become what it is today. Now, we all know the story about how it hadn't really panned out. They weren't recouping any money. And again, the Fertittas were on, a few years later, were on the brink of closing up shop and getting rid of it, when they decided to give it one last go, throw some money at it, and create this program, this reality program, The Ultimate Fighter. From there, we all know the rest is history. We get the Forrest Griffin-Stephan Bonner finals fight that had people nationwide tuning in, just a knockdown, drag-out war for 3 rounds that really drew attention to the sport and to the UFC again and brought it from the brink of disaster. And from there, the rest truly is history, to where we are today. $4 billion sale to WME. Conor McGregor making $12+ million a fight. It truly has become a major market money endeavor. And, it's fun to watch. And now we've got offshoots. We've got the UFC and Bellator and One Fighting Championship and the Professional Fighting League and Legacy FC. We've got all these other promotions that have all come about. We had Pride over in Japan and Strike Force and all these ones that have come and gone, but they can all thank the UFC and Art Davie and Rorion Gracie for having a vision, wanting to put together an event, and really, wanted to test. Really, it was a spectacle to promote the Gracies and what they do in their jiu-jitsu. And that event led to what we all know and love today. So that was just a little 15-minute synopsis of the background and history of the UFC, much of which you may have known, some you may not have, but it's just my little version of what got us to where we are today. And being the 25th anniversary, I thought it fitting. Peace.